A KGB agent's love letter exposed an entire spy network. Not a coded message, not a military secret. A real love letter, desperate, reckless, and written in invisible ink. February 1962. Vienna was crawling with spies from east and west, and Major Yuri Loginov was Moscow's master puppeteer, running 23 secret agents across Europe like pieces on a chessboard. NATO communications, military plans, classified documents, it all flowed through him to the Kremlin. Then he met Katerina, a German translator who made him remember what it felt like to be human. And in one moment of unbearable loneliness, this trained killer of the KGB did the unthinkable. He wrote her a letter confessing everything: his real identity, his desperate love, and his plan to defect. But here's what Moscow never told him. Katerina had been dead for 3 weeks, executed on orders from his own successor. The letter he sent to a ghost would destroy 12 years of Soviet intelligence work in 72 hours. Because when you teach a man to bury his heart for decades, what happens when it suddenly starts beating again? Quick comment where you're watching from. I love seeing how these forgotten Cold War stories reach people across the world. And if you're fascinated by the secret human stories hidden in classified archives, subscribe, because every day we unlock another vault of buried history. Now, let's discover how one forbidden love letter brought down an empire of secrets. The Vienna Central Post Office stood like a gray monument to routine in February 1962. 6 stories of sorted secrets, packages, and promises, processing 30,000 pieces of mail every day. Hermann Kraus had worked the night shift here for 23 years. His fingers knew the weight of paper the way a pianist knows keys. Bills felt different from love letters, business correspondence from personal confessions. But that particular Thursday evening, as snow gathered on the windowsills and the sorting room hummed with mechanical precision, Hermann's trained hands stopped at one envelope. The address was written to a flower shop on Graben Street in perfect German script. Too perfect, actually. The kind of handwriting that comes from someone who learned German from textbooks, not childhood. The paper was wrong too. Heavier than standard Austrian stock, with a texture that suggested Eastern European manufacturing. During the war, Hermann had smuggled resistance letters past Nazi censors. He knew what secrets felt like between his fingers. And this envelope carried that familiar weight, the burden of hidden words. When he held it to the sorting room's fluorescent light, he saw them. Shadows beneath shadows. Ghost writing swimming beneath the visible ink. Someone had used the old tricks, the chemical treatments that revealed themselves only under heat or light or specific developing agents. Someone professional, someone desperate enough to risk everything on one letter reaching its destination. Hermann made a choice that would redirect the course of Cold War history. Instead of dropping the letter into the Graben Street delivery bag, he walked it personally to his supervisor. Within 3 hours, it would be photographed, chemically analyzed, and duplicated in the basement of the Austrian State Security Building. Within 6 hours, copies would reach the CIA station at the American Embassy. Within 12 hours, every Western intelligence service would be racing to decode what KGB Major Yuri Loginov had written in his moment of absolute vulnerability. The letter's surface message was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Written in Russian, then translated roughly into German, it read, "My dear Katya, I have lived 41 years, and only in these last months have I understood what it means to be alive. You spoke of poetry, and I laughed because I had forgotten such things existed. Now I read Pushkin and think only of you." But beneath this declaration of love, chemical analysis revealed operational details that made veteran intelligence officers stop breathing. Meeting coordinates at Schönbrunn Palace, emergency dead drops across Vienna, and, most dangerously, fragments of code names: Klaus, Marie, Thomas, Elizabeth, names that would soon correspond to some of the most damaging intelligence leaks NATO had experienced since the war's end. To understand how a professional intelligence officer could make such a catastrophic mistake, you need to understand who Yuri Loginov was before love destroyed him. His KGB file, partially recovered after the Soviet Union's collapse, paints a portrait of the perfect Soviet intelligence weapon. Born in Leningrad in 1921, he survived the 900-day siege as a teenager, watching his mother die of starvation while German shells turned his city to rubble. That kind of survival leaves marks that never fade. It teaches you that emotion is luxury, sentiment is weakness, and love is the most dangerous vulnerability of all. The KGB recruited him in 1946 specifically because he had learned to feel nothing. His training reports describe a man who could watch interrogations without flinching, who could befriend targets for years, then destroy them without hesitation, who could live inside false identities so completely that polygraph tests couldn't detect the deception. By 1950, he was running operations in East Berlin. By 1955, he was handling networks across Eastern Europe. By 1960, he arrived in Vienna as the architect of Moscow's most ambitious intelligence operation in the West. Operation Danube was Yuri's masterpiece. Over 12 years, he had carefully positioned 23 agents throughout NATO's communication structure. The French diplomatic service, Swiss banking systems, and American military installations. Each agent operated in absolute isolation, unaware of the other's existence. Only Yuri knew the full scope. Only Yuri held all the threads. His agents weren't ideological converts or blackmailed assets. They were carefully selected individuals with specific vulnerabilities that Yuri exploited with surgical precision. Klaus Richter joined after his son needed cancer treatment that only Soviet medical connections could provide. Marie Dubois was recruited through a love affair with a Czech diplomat who was actually Yuri's subordinate. Thomas Hartmann simply wanted money, lots of it, to maintain his Zurich lifestyle. Elizabeth Campbell believed she was helping prevent nuclear war by ensuring balance between the superpowers. Each recruitment took months or years of patient cultivation. Yuri would study his targets like a botanist studies rare flowers, learning their hopes, their fears, their secret shames. Then he would appear in their lives at exactly the right moment, sometimes as salvation, sometimes as understanding, always as the solution to their most pressing problem. But something happened to Yuri Loginov in autumn of 1961 that his training couldn't suppress. At a diplomatic reception at the Hofburg Palace, he was introduced to Katharina Müller, a 34-year-old translator working for the Austrian Foreign Ministry. She was assigned to help smooth communication between Russian and German-speaking delegates at a trade conference. Yuri was attending in his cover identity as a Soviet trade representative. Their first conversation was about translation errors in Goethe's Faust between German and Russian editions. Katharina laughed at Yuri's deliberately mangled pronunciation of Gretchen, then spent 20 minutes patiently coaching him through the German cheese sound while diplomats circled them with champagne and calculations. For the first time in 15 years, Yuri found himself genuinely laughing. Not the practiced social laugh of an intelligence officer maintaining cover, but the surprised bark of actual joy. Katharina Müller was everything Soviet intelligence training taught Yuri to exploit, yet nothing about her felt like a target. Her father had died at Stalingrad when she was 7. Her Austrian mother raised her on war widows' pension and poetry, filling their small apartment with books in 4 languages. She spoke about her father's death without bitterness, a sadness so pure it made Yuri's chest constrict with forgotten grief. They met again 2 weeks after the reception, supposedly by accident at Café Central. Yuri had orchestrated it, of course, following her routine, learning she took coffee there every Tuesday at 4 o'clock. But when she smiled and invited him to sit, when she pulled out a Russian edition of Pushkin she'd found in a second-hand bookshop, when she asked him to read Eugene Onegin aloud so she could hear the language properly sung, something inside him cracked like ice in spring. Over the following months, Tuesday coffees became Thursday dinners, then Sunday walks through the Prater. Yuri filed reports to Moscow Center describing his cultivation of a potentially valuable foreign ministry asset. But the reports grew vaguer, the operational details thinner. He stopped recording their conversations. He stopped photographing her documents when she left her purse unattended. He stopped being a KGB officer during those stolen hours and became simply Yuri, or rather, Alexei, the trade representative who loved poetry and spoke terrible German. Katerina never asked questions that suggested suspicion. She seemed to accept him exactly as presented. A lonely Soviet official far from home, trying to navigate Vienna's complicated neutrality. When she spoke about the war, she focused not on politics, but on human cost. Her uncle had been drafted into the Wehrmacht and never returned from the Eastern Front. Her mother's Jewish friends had vanished in 1942. She understood that survival sometimes meant terrible choices, that good people could serve evil systems, that moral clarity was a luxury of peacetime. "We're all just trying to find something real," she told him one evening as they watched the Danube reflect December moonlight. "In a world full of lies and positions and diplomatic facades, isn't it wonderful when two people can just speak truly to each other?" Yuri almost confessed everything that night. The words gathered in his throat like a physical weight, but his training held. Instead, he kissed her, the first genuine kiss of his adult life, free of operational purpose or calculated seduction. Meanwhile, Operation Danube was delivering intelligence gold to Moscow. Klaus Richter had accessed NATO's communication protocols for nuclear weapon deployment. Marie Dubois was copying diplomatic cables that revealed growing fractures in the French-American alliance. Thomas Hartmann's banking network was mapping CIA financial operations across Europe. Elizabeth Campbell had identified every American nuclear weapon storage site in West Germany. The intelligence was so valuable that KGB Chairman Shelepin personally commended Yuri in a coded message. Promotion to colonel was guaranteed. A return to Moscow was planned for early 1962, where he would receive the Order of Lenin and take charge of Western European operations from a desk at Lubyanka. But Yuri didn't want to leave Vienna. More precisely, he couldn't imagine leaving Katerina. He began making mistakes. Small ones at first, staying too long at dinner when he should have been attending dead drops, missing a scheduled radio transmission because he was walking with her through the Christkindlmarkt, using operational funds to buy her a first edition of Rilke's poetry for Christmas. His deputy, Captain Pavel Orlov, noticed the changes. In a report dated January 3, 1962, Orlov wrote, "Major Loginov shows signs of ideological deviation. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible recall." But Orlov's report was intercepted by Major Viktor Petrov, the man designated to replace Yuri as Vienna resident. Petrov had his own reasons for wanting Yuri to fall. On January 8th, the recall order arrived from Moscow Center. Yuri was to return within 1 week for consultations. He knew what that meant. Someone who knew too much, who held too many secrets, who showed signs of weakness. They never survived consultations. At best, he'd disappear into a psychiatric hospital. At worst, a bullet in Lubyanka's basement. That night, in his safe house overlooking the Stadtpark, Yuri made his fatal decision. He would write to Katerina. He would confess everything. He would offer her the truth she deserved and ask her to run with him. Together, they could disappear into Switzerland or Spain, become different people, live the small, honest life that had grown like a desperate dream in his mind. He wrote in Russian first, the language of his real self. "My beloved Katya, everything I have told you is a lie except for one thing, that I love you. My name is not Alexei. I am not merely a trade representative. I am an intelligence officer, and I have done terrible things in service to a cause I no longer believe in. But you have reminded me that I was once human, and I want to be human again." Using the chemical techniques he'd perfected over decades, he embedded meeting instructions in invisible ink. The Gloriette at Schönbrunn Palace, February 14th, noon. If she came, they would run together. If she didn't, he would understand. Either way, he was finished with the life of lies. The letter was his resignation from the secret world, written in love and invisible ink. What Yuri Loginov didn't know as he sealed that letter was that Katerina Müller had been dead for 19 days. On January 12th at 9:47 p.m., she was found in an alley behind her apartment building, her neck broken, her purse missing. Vienna police classified it as a robbery homicide. The two teenagers they arrested 3 days later confessed to several muggings, but swore they'd never killed anyone. The truth lay in a KGB communication intercepted years later by the NSA. Major Viktor Petrov, eager to claim Yuri's network and eliminate complications, had ordered Katerina's elimination after reading Orlov's report about Yuri's ideological deviation. The execution was performed by Department 13, the KGB's assassination unit, using their signature method, making murder look like street crime. Petrov's calculation was cold but logical. Remove the woman, and Yuri would return to Moscow without resistance. The networks would transfer cleanly. No messy defection, no compromised operations. Just a heartbroken officer who would learn that his Austrian girlfriend had died in a random act of violence. Grief would paralyze him. Guilt would silence him. The system would continue. But Petrov hadn't counted on the letter, or Hermann Krause's experienced fingers, or the web of intelligence services that would pounce on this unexpected gift. By February 15th, the letter had been read, analyzed, and cross-referenced by every major Western intelligence agency. CIA Station Chief Robert Holbrook called it the intelligence equivalent of finding the Rosetta Stone. The emotional confession was fascinating, but the embedded operational details were invaluable. Meeting sites, dead drops, partial code names, fragments that could unlock Soviet intelligence operations across Europe. A joint task force formed within hours. Operation Valentine, they called it, with gallows humor about love's capacity for destruction. The Americans provided signals intelligence and satellite surveillance. The British contributed their best interrogators and code breakers. The Austrians offered local police support and surveillance teams. The French, nervous about what might be discovered, insisted on inclusion. The first break came from the code names. Klaus had to be someone with access to NATO communications. Marie suggested French connections. Thomas sounded Swiss or German. Elizabeth was almost certainly American or British. Cross-referencing these fragments with personnel files, travel records, and financial anomalies, the task force identified probable suspects within 72 hours. Klaus Richter was the first to notice surveillance. The NATO communications specialist in Munich had survived this long by being paranoid. When the same Mercedes appeared 3 times on his route to work, when his neighbor suddenly became friendly after 2 years of silence, when his telephone developed an almost imperceptible click, he knew. His emergency protocol was to destroy everything and run for the Czech border. But the CIA was ready. They let him pack, let him burn his codebooks, let him believe escape was possible. They wanted him panicked, careless, likely to make mistakes or contact other network members. When he finally ran on February 20th, racing toward the frontier in a stolen car, they arrested him at a roadblock just 10 kilometers from safety. Under interrogation, Richter broke within 6 hours. Not from physical pressure. The CIA had learned that torture produced lies, not truth. Instead, they read him passages from Yuri's letter. "I have betrayed everything I once believed for a system that devours its own children." They told him about Katerina's death, showed him the KGB communication ordering her murder. They demonstrated that the system he served had killed an innocent woman simply to eliminate an inconvenience. Richter gave them 3 names. Those 3, when arrested, gave 7 more. The network collapsed like a house of cards in an earthquake. By February 25th, 17 members were in custody. 3 had committed suicide using concealed cyanide pills. 3 others had vanished so completely that even Yuri's records couldn't locate them. Meanwhile, Yuri himself was trapped in Vienna, under constant surveillance but not yet arrested. The CIA wanted him to run, to seek help, to reveal any remaining contacts. They watched him visit the flower shop on Graben Street, looking for Katarina. They watched him wait at the Gloriette Pavilion on February 14th, standing in the snow for 3 hours as his hope slowly died. They watched him return to his apartment and sit in darkness, understanding finally that something had gone terribly wrong. On February 26th, desperate and broken, Yuri made an extraordinary decision. He walked into St. Stephen's Cathedral and approached a priest he'd seen Katarina mention, Father Anton Müller. He didn't know this was her uncle. He only knew he needed to reach the Americans, and churches had always been neutral ground in the intelligence world. "I need to speak with your CIA," he told the priest in broken German. "I have information about Soviet operations across Europe, but I need to know what happened to Katarina Müller." Father Anton's face went pale. He looked at this Russian stranger who spoke his niece's name with such devastating pain and made his own choice. Within an hour, Robert Holbrook was sitting in the confessional booth, listening to Yuri Loginov offer everything. Not for money, not for safety, but for the simple truth about why Katarina never came. The conversation that followed would be studied in intelligence schools for decades as a masterclass in human manipulation and genuine tragedy intertwined. Robert Holbrook sat in the confessional darkness, separated from Yuri Loginov by a thin wooden screen that might as well have been the Iron Curtain itself. The CIA station chief had interrogated dozens of Soviet defectors, but never one who opened with, "I don't want asylum. I don't want money. I want to know why she didn't come. Your network is finished," Holbrook said quietly. "We have 17 of your agents in custody. 3 are dead by their own hand. But you know that already, don't you? You've been watching the news, seeing the arrests, understanding that your letter destroyed everything." "The letter?" Yuri's voice cracked. "She never received it?" "Oh, she received it. We made sure of that." Holbrook let the lie hang between them before continuing. "But she couldn't come to your meeting, Major Loginov. She's been dead since January 12th. The silence that followed lasted 43 seconds. Holbrook counted them on his watch. Then came a sound he'd never heard from a grown man, a noise like an animal caught in a trap, gnawing off its own leg to escape. When Yuri finally spoke again, his voice had aged 20 years. "How?" Holbrook slid a folder through the small opening between them. Inside were the morgue photographs, the police report, and most crucially, the intercepted KGB communication. Yuri read in the dim light filtering through stained glass, his hands steady despite the earthquake in his chest. The KGB message was clinical in its brutality. Asset Vienna 7 eliminated per Directive 4. Cover story maintained. Primary reports, no operational compromise. The authorization signature belonged to Major Viktor Petrov. "Petrov," Yuri whispered. "He was supposed to be my replacement. We served together in Berlin. His daughter plays violin. He wanted your networks without your complications," Holbrook explained. "Our analysts believe he identified your emotional attachment through routine surveillance. Maybe you held her hand too long. Maybe you smiled too genuinely. Whatever it was, he decided she was a security risk." Yuri studied Katarina's morgue photograph with the focused intensity of a man memorizing his last sight of water before crossing a desert. Then he closed the folder and pushed it back through the opening. "I'll give you everything," he said, "not just Danube. I know about Volga, the sleeper network Moscow is preparing to activate. I know about the submarine communication stations in Cuba. I know which Western diplomats are being blackmailed and which generals are taking Soviet money. 20 years of secrets, but I have conditions." Holbrook leaned forward. This was more than they'd dreamed of extracting. "First," Yuri continued, "I want to testify at the trials of my agents. They deserve to know why they were betrayed. Second, I want Father Anton to perform a proper funeral mass for Katarina. She was buried quickly, quietly, like she didn't matter. Third, I want to face Viktor Petrov. Not to kill him. I'm finished with killing, but he needs to know what he destroyed. Petrov is in Moscow. That's impossible. He'll be in Vienna next month. March 15 through 18, negotiating the prisoner exchange for your pilot Francis Gary Powers. I know because I helped plan the security arrangements. Holbrook's mind raced. Powers, shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, was America's most valuable prisoner in Soviet hands. If they could use Yuri's information to disrupt the exchange, to grab Petrov, the intelligence coup would be unprecedented. Over the next 3 days, Yuri provided information that reshaped Western understanding of Soviet intelligence operations. The Volga network consisted of 48 sleeper agents, embedded so deep that most didn't even know they were Soviet assets. They thought they were helping various peace movements or academic exchanges. The Cuban submarine stations could communicate directly with Soviet ballistic missile submarines, bypassing Moscow entirely. The blackmail operations targeted not just diplomats but their families, creating webs of compromise that extended through generations. Each revelation came with a story. The West German defense minister's son, kidnapped and drugged in East Berlin, photographed in compromising positions, then released with no memory of the event. But the photos remained in KGB files. The British scientist who thought he was corresponding with a colleague in Prague, never knowing his letters were routed through Lubyanka, where they were analyzed for exploitable research. The American sergeant at Ramstein Air Base, whose gambling debts were mysteriously paid by a generous uncle, who only asked for occasional weather reports. "You want to know the truth about intelligence work," Yuri said during his 7th hour of debriefing. "It's not about stealing secrets, it's about stealing souls. You find what people love most, then you make them betray it. I did this to 23 people. Petrov did it to me. The system continues." On March 1st, the CIA made an extraordinary decision. They would allow Yuri to appear via closed-circuit television at the trials of his captured agents. It violated every protocol, but the psychological value was deemed worth the risk. If Yuri's agents saw their handler confess and repent, they might provide even more intelligence. The testimony, delivered from a secure location, was unlike anything heard in a Cold War courtroom. Yuri didn't just detail operational methods, he dissected the moral architecture of betrayal. Looking directly at the camera, knowing his agents were watching, he said, "I recruited you with your own dreams. Klaus, I promised your son would live when you thought he would die. He's healthy now, playing football, because of treatments Soviet doctors provided. Marie, I gave you love when you had given up on it, even though that love was performed by an actor I controlled. Thomas, I fed your greed until it consumed your caution. Elizabeth, I convinced you that betraying small secrets would prevent nuclear war, when actually you were helping Moscow plan for one." He paused, his face a map of exhaustion and sorrow. "But my greatest crime wasn't the lies I told you. It was teaching you to live with them, to wake up every morning and pretend to be loyal while selling out your colleagues, to kiss your families knowing you were endangering them, to exist in that space between who you were and who you pretended to be. I made you into me, and now I know that space is hell." 11 of the 17 captured agents agreed to cooperate after hearing Yuri's testimony. Marie Dubois wept through her entire interrogation, revealing not just intelligence protocols, but the human cost of her deception, the genuine friends she'd betrayed, the diplomatic initiatives she'd sabotaged, the peace negotiations that failed because Moscow knew every Western position in advance. Klaus Richter provided technical details that forced NATO to redesign its entire communication infrastructure. Elizabeth Campbell offered something even more valuable: the locations of dead drops still containing intelligence from agents not yet identified. But it was Thomas Hartmann, the Swiss banker, who delivered the most unexpected revelation. "Yuri wasn't the only one who fell in love," he confessed. Half his network had someone: a wife who didn't know, a child they were protecting, a lover they couldn't explain their absences to. He recruited us through love, then watched love destroy us. It's almost poetic. On March 15, 1962, Viktor Petrov arrived in Vienna for the powers exchange negotiations. The CIA watched him check into the Imperial Hotel, followed him to meetings at the Soviet embassy, photographed him drinking coffee at the same Café Central where Yuri had met Katerina. They had a dozen opportunities to grab him, but Holbrooke had a different plan. That evening, Petrov received a package at his hotel. Inside was a single photograph. Yuri and Katerina at the Christkindlmarkt, laughing at something beyond the frame's edge. On the back, in Yuri's handwriting, "She died believing in beauty. You live believing in nothing." Petrov's reaction, captured by CIA surveillance cameras hidden in his room, was unexpected. He stared at the photograph for 20 minutes, then made an unscheduled call to Moscow. The NSA intercepted it. "Request immediate recall. Vienna operation compromised." But Moscow ordered him to complete the powers exchange first. 3 days later, as he boarded his flight to Moscow, Petrov collapsed on the jet bridge. Heart attack, the Soviet embassy claimed. The autopsy, conducted by Soviet doctors, was never released. Some intelligence historians believe the KGB eliminated Petrov for allowing Yuri's network to collapse. Others suggest he took his own life, using the same untraceable compounds his department had perfected. But Robert Holbrooke, in a memoir published 30 years later, offered a different theory. Sometimes the weight of what we've done becomes physically unbearable. Petrov spent his life creating perfect murders. Perhaps his heart simply recognized what he'd become. The powers exchange proceeded without Petrov. On Glienicke Bridge between East and West Berlin, France's Gary Powers walked to freedom, while Soviet Colonel Rudolf Abel walked the opposite direction. Neither man knew that the exchange had been facilitated by intelligence extracted from a love letter written in invisible ink. Father Anton Müller held Katerina's memorial service on March 20, 1962. The small church was nearly empty, her mother too grief-stricken to attend, a few colleagues from the foreign ministry, and in the back row, 3 CIA officers serving as Yuri's proxies. He wasn't allowed to attend, but had written something to be read aloud. Father Anton's voice echoed in the medieval stones as he read, "Katerina believed translation was sacred work, taking thoughts from one language and giving them new life in another. She translated my frozen soul back into something human. Every word of love I learned from her. Every moment I chose conscience over duty, I chose because she showed me it was possible. She lives on not in memory, but in every act of moral courage by those who knew her." The most extraordinary epilogue came 6 months later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. As the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, a Soviet military intelligence officer in Cuba, Colonel Boris Fedorov, used one of Yuri's old Danube dead drops to pass critical information to the CIA. The location of tactical nuclear weapons, their authorization protocols, the fact that Soviet field commanders could launch without Moscow's permission, intelligence that allowed Kennedy to avoid military actions that would have triggered automatic nuclear response. Fedorov's message was brief. For Yuri Loginov, who proved that conscience survives even in hell. Yuri himself lived quietly in Oregon under an assumed identity, teaching Russian literature at a community college. Students remembered him as a melancholy professor who could make Pushkin's words sound like prayers. He never remarried, never spoke publicly about his past, never wrote memoirs that could have made him wealthy. When he died in 1987, his only possessions of value were 43 letters from Katerina, which he'd somehow retrieved from her apartment through Father Anton. The last letter, dated January 11, 1962, one day before her death, contained a passage that perhaps explains everything. "You asked if I could love you knowing who you really are. But my dear Alexei, or whatever your name is, I already know. I see it in your eyes when you think I'm not watching. You're a man carrying terrible secrets, serving a system you no longer believe in, searching for redemption in all the wrong places. I love you not despite these truths, but because you're finally brave enough to want to escape them. The love letter that destroyed an empire of secrets remains classified, stored in CIA archives, but its truth echoes still. Even in the darkest corners of the secret world, love remains operational.